Hello, welcome back to the shed. In today's video we're going to be tackling the basic handsaw, or an introduction to the handsaw. Now most of you, when it comes to handsaws, probably realize that this is the handsaw and this is what you know as the handsaw. The hardware saw, impulse hardened teeth that can't be sharpened, and a big ugly plastic handle. Well, when it comes to handsaws, which I've got down on the bench here, there's a lot more to it than just this basic hardware style handsaw. Handsaws, just like the hand planes, go back a long way. I don't actually have any details of exactly how far back they go, but they will have gone back a very similar amount of time as the hand plane, because they go hand in hand. You saw something to width or length and then hand plane it. So now that we've got that out of the way, what I'm going to be covering today is the Western saws versus the Japanese saws, and per se they're not the only differences, but in the modern woodworking sort of world, that's how we refer to them. We refer to Western saws and Japanese saws. So first of all, I just want to give a quick overview of the different saw types of the Western saw, and then we'll explain the Japanese saws. Western saws come in panel saw like this, obviously a panel with a handle. They're available in a back saw style like this, with either a brass or steel back, but they've got a metal back that the blade is in. And there's also available the coping saw. The two main Japanese saws are the two that I've got here. We've got this one, which is Ryoba style, and we can see they're very different. And this back saw one is a Dozuki. So we can see that even in the Japanese we have essentially a panel saw and a back saw. The main difference between the Western saws and the Japanese saws is that the Western saws cut on the push stroke, the Japanese saws cut on the pull stroke, so when you're pulling towards you they cut. There is two different teeth types when it comes to handsaws. We have a rip tooth and a crosscut tooth. The rip cut is essentially a set of chisels in alignment, and it's used for cutting down the grain this way. Essentially what it does is chips the material out, allowing you to rip with the grain, and it's not going to move with the grain easily, it's going to remove that grain. Then obviously we have crosscut. So if we were trying to use a series of chisels to go across your grain, and if you would actually grab a chisel and do that, you know that you'd be going across the grain with that chisel and it would get stuck and it'd be difficult to go across. So we have what's called a crosscut saw. Now the crosscut saw is a series of knives in little points. The example I like to make, it's like the tip of a diamond point knife like this, and we have a series of teeth going this way, this way, that way, and so we have essentially a series of knives on the top. And what happens on a board with a knife? We cut right across, we score the fibers. Before we move on and look at these saws and how they differ and what they're used for, there's two more things we need to look at. So the first thing I want to tackle is how many teeth are on the saw and how that's measured. The number of teeth on the saw is measured in points per inch and teeth per inch. Points per inch, or PPI, is the American style of measurement. Teeth per inch, or TPI, is the British measurement. So let's have a closer look at this and see exactly what that means. Points per inch means that it's measured from how many points, so the top of the tooth, in an inch. Teeth per inch is measured from the valley and measures the entire tooth. So we're always going to have a full points per inch measurement, but we could end up with a half teeth per inch measurement. So we could end up with half a tooth depending on where the inch ends. So why am I telling you this? Why do we need to know the two different measurements that are used? Well, if you're from America, you need to know the American one. If you're from England or a lot of the Commonwealth countries, they'll use the British style. However, we also need to know teeth per inch or points per inch, whichever you use, to determine how aggressive our saw is. Less teeth per inch, more aggressive, much bigger teeth, much rougher. More teeth per inch, much smoother, much more dedicated, and you can get your joinery saws that have a very high number of teeth or points per inch. So now we move on to the last point that we need to cover before we look at the saws, and that is saw set. Now, What saw set is, it is essentially an offset. Although we call it set, it essentially means offset. So what it is doing is offsetting the teeth from the back of the blade. Set is essentially the teeth being moved out like so. So they are sitting wider. So one tooth goes one way, one tooth goes the other way, right the way along the saw. What that's doing is making the tooth edge wider than the back of the blade of your saw, so it doesn't jam when you're chopping through the wood. Some saws going back were taper ground, and that meant that the blade itself was thinner at the top than it was at the cutting edge, but we still had set on those teeth. Now without set, your saw would jam in your kerf. So a kerf is what your saw makes when you chop through the wood. And if that wasn't made wide enough, as the saw came through, it would bind on itself and get stuck. So now we've got those basics down pat and we understand those basic terms. There are other terms that we'll cover when it comes to sharpening, but I've already got that video down below, so check out both the sharpening video for the rip cut and cross cut if you're interested in that, and also how to reprofile the teeth. So I'll leave those links down below for you so you can check them out if and when you're ready to see them. So first of all, we're going to look at the Western saws and then we'll move into the Japanese saws. I started with Western saws. I prefer the Western saws, and I do think they are more difficult to learn with, but once you've got them down pat, I think they do a better job. So first of all, with the Western saw, which is essentially what the hardware saw was, is a saw like this. Now, a saw like this is called a panel saw for obvious reasons. It's a panel of steel held in a handle. The purpose of the handle is obviously to drive the plate or its teeth through the wood to chop the timber. These saws do come in varying lengths, and they do come in rip cut and cross cut, as I mentioned before. They tend to have less teeth per inch, and they tend to be for doing rougher work. You can have them with a higher teeth per inch, up to about maybe 12 is the most that I've seen in them. And they can do a little finer work, but since they're a panel that flip-flops around like you can see here, they're not used for fine work. When it comes to the cross-cut variety of a panel saw, they tend to have slightly higher teeth per inch just to get a cleaner job, because they've got knives that are crossing the fibers, whereas the rip cut can go to much less teeth than a cross-cut tends to. Although I have seen them for both, and it depends. But they're generally used for rough chopping of length of your timber. Essentially like what your drop saw does for a power saw. Next, we move into our back saws. Now, in our back saws, we have them with either a brass or steel back. The blade is held or pinched into this with the handle to drive it, and that means that we don't get flexing in the blade because we've got this nice thick back that's holding it nice and straight. As I said, we also get it in the steel backing. First of all, I'm just going to cover the different handle types because it's not really important in the use of the saw, but you will see them out there. We have a fully enclosed handle like this, and you'll get them on both large and small tenon saws. We have a pistol grip like this, which you're only generally going to find in the smaller back saws. And you have a straight handle like this that you'll only find in this style of small, lightweight saw. The larger of the back saws are generally referred to as tenon saws because they are used to chop the cheeks off a tenon. Now, if you don't know what a tenon is, I'll leave the link down below where I went through actually doing a mortise and tenon joint, so you can check that beginner guide out down in the description. The larger ones, or the larger, they can be very long, anywhere from 200 mil up to about 450. There are some really, really long ones that are 500, and they're for what is called a miter box, but we won't talk about them. The standard tenon saw is somewhere between 200 and about 350 mil long. The one I have here is 250 mil long, and that length works best for me with all my back saws. This one is a larger saw, as you can see here. It's got quite a large gap up to the back, versus the smaller one here, which, as you can see, if we compare them next side by side, we have much less plate depth to that back. With back saws, obviously the depth of the plate is your main restriction in what you can chop. That's why the tenon saws have a larger stop, because they're generally for cutting larger joints or more material, so you need to go deeper. The smaller tenon saws, like this one, can obviously still be used for cutting small tenon. The smaller tenon saws such as this, and especially the ones with the pistol grip, are what we would consider a dovetail saw. And they're mainly reserved for chopping dovetails. We have smaller dovetail saws like this one here, and this one's called a gent saw. And that one is the one that has the straight handle. It's very lightweight, very small depth on plate, and excels at cutting dovetails. Now, if I didn't mention it before, back saws come, once again, in both rip and cross cut. The smaller ones that are used for dovetails should always be in a rip cut, and the bigger tenon saws are where you might have one that comes in a rip cut and one that comes in a cross cut. The rip cut of the tenon saw is obviously designed for cutting with the grain, chopping the shoulders or the cheeks of your tenon off. Cross cutting would be used where you're crossing across the wood to take that cheek off, which is like just imagine that we've taken a chunk out of the piece and you need to cut it off at the bottom after we've chopped down. And we would cross cut that using a crosscut saw. Now you might feel that that's where that ends. That's the be all and end all. It's not exactly true. Some makers out there, especially YouTubers like Paul Sellers comes to mind, he doesn't use crosscut tenon saws at all that I'm aware of. He uses a tenon saw that has very fine teeth per inch, somewhere between 12 to 14, and he uses that for cross-cutting off the shoulders. And that works fairly well, because when these rip cut saws have very fine teeth, they do leave a fairly fine cut, very similar to that of a crosscut saw. So all I'm saying is you might not need to go out and buy multiples of each in rip and crosscut, because it might not be necessary. There are different techniques that you can use that you're going to get a nice clean cut using a tenon saw by severing the fibers with a knife or a marking gauge prior to using your rip cut saw for that work. And then we come to the coping saw. So the coping saw is, the tooth pattern on these ones is always going to be a rip cut as far as I'm aware. I don't think it comes in a cross cut. As you can see here, a blade tensioned by a metal frame here. You twist the handle up, puts tension on the blade, and it plays a tune. Now, if you get the right tune, some people say that that's how you know when it's tight enough. I just do it up as tight as it goes until it stops. A coping saw is essential in anyone's toolbox for cutting curves. There are more saws out there that I don't have that are called frame saws, and this is essentially a frame saw. You can get big wooden frame saws for cutting big shapes. They're called turning saws and buck saws and all the like, and they go back quite a ways. I don't have any to show you, so just know that there are frame saws out there, but they're not very common, which is why I'm not covering them too heavily in this video. The coping saw is pretty good to have in your toolkit, especially for when you're cutting dovetails, because it allows you to come in and cut the waste out of your dovetails. Like this, you could actually use them to come in and you actually remove the waste like this from your dovetail, and you can remove that waste a little easier before chiseling. That pretty much wraps up the basic overview of the Western saws. I want to move into the Japanese pull saws. The Ryoba saw is a panel saw that cuts on the pull stroke. As I said, the Japanese saws do that. The Ryoba has a long handle here, sometimes wrapped in plastic, sometimes completely plastic. This one's wrapped in a cane, which makes it one of the better ones. It's just more comfortable to hold. Now, we obviously don't have a normal handle. We've just got this straight handle on these, so you can grip them. You can use this to reference on your arm to help keep the saw straight. We'll cover these saws a little later on and how to actually use them. The Ryoba, which makes it different from a lot of other saws, has, and especially the Western saws, has a rip cut tooth on one side and a cross cut tooth on the other side. This one is about 200 mil long. You can get them up to about 3 or 350 as I understand. And they work quite well at doing the rough cutting. They do cut extremely smoothly with their cross-cut side. However, accuracy for joinery, you probably don't want to be using such a flexible saw for that. And for that, the Japanese has the Dozuki saw. And that is essentially their back saw. It's got a metal back here, held in the handle, same handle style, but these teeth on the Dozuki have what's called a hybrid tooth pattern. They're not quite a rip cut, they're not quite a cross cut, they're a combination of both, and they can do both the function of the cross cut and rip cut, and they have an extremely thin plate. I believe the plate was supposed to be on this one was like 0.3 millimeters. I'm not so sure that this one is exactly that thin, but that's what it said on the website. They tend to be used for the joinery, such as dovetails, and a lot of fine cuts for the very fine Japanese joinery that is out there, which is a lot more complicated than any Western joinery. One other note that I don't want to pass over, and I want you guys to know, the main reason I included these Japanese saws is I've been using them to review them, and they are a lot cheaper than any of these Western saws. You might be able to pick up a panel saw that you have to restore, and if you want to look at a video on how to restore one, I will leave that link down below as well. You can pick them up very cheap, especially your panel saws. Tenon saws, whether they're new or vintage, are going to cost you. They're going to be expensive, and that's why I don't recommend actually buying vintage ones. The new ones probably are better value than a lot of the vintage ones you can buy. The vintage ones have a lot of problems, whereas the brand new ones don't. But it depends how much money you have available. And if you're looking for just a dedicated tenon saw, you can pick up one of these gent saws very, very cheaply, and they're going to get you started. And I highly recommend the gent saw because I use it all the time for my dovetails, and it was the first dovetail dedicated saw that I have, and it's still mainly the only one I use today. Coping saws, well, if you need a coping saw, you can pick them up from hardware stores. They're inexpensive and really versatile, so that's why that was included. But the main reason that the Japanese saws are here is they are a lot cheaper. They are fractions of the cost of, say, a brand new panel saw. If you're looking at, say, a maker called Pax for the either tenon saw or panel saws, here in Australia you're looking 300 plus for a panel saw. These Japanese saws, I picked this one up for about $37. And this one was very similar at about 32, 35, something like that. I think it's vital that you understand what it is that you want to do. If you're doing Western joinery and Western woodworking, perhaps the Western saws are the way to go, but you can get away doing even all of the Western joinery with your Japanese saws as long as you learn. And the learning curve, I've been told, I haven't really experienced it, but apparently the Japanese saws are easier to learn with for beginners. I've heard a lot of people say that, but since I've been so experienced with the Western saws, I just picked the pull saws up and found them easy to use straight off. So I can't say whether that's because they're easy to use to start with, because I've already learnt with the Western saws, which a lot of people have told me and have mentioned are harder to start with. So what do you think down below? Let me know, for those of you that have used saws, what you think. Which one's easier, the Western or the Japanese saws? What do you guys use in your own workshops? If some of you have already got saws, I'd love to hear. But the main idea of this video is to introduce the saws. I may do some more detailed videos on each of these saws and the saw types and the different lengths and things in the future. If that's something you'd like, let me know in the comments below. If you'd like a little more detail on how to use these saws and the processes and exactly how they're set up and everything. So if you like this video and you got a lot of value out of it, please consider liking and subscribing down here, and share this video out with others out there so I can help them out as well. If you know anyone that's into woodworking or thinking about hand tool woodworking, please send them the link to this video so they can check this out. If If you'd like to support me, please consider checking me out on Patreon. Links in the description below. And if you liked this type of video and you'd like some other beginner videos, please check out the video on the screen here and the playlist to my beginner list right here. Bye for now.